Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to open up this PowerPoint for you guys and talk through interpreting EKGs or ECGs so you guys have a little bit of a better understanding and you don't have to listen to Sarah on rn.com. Okay, so first I think it's really important for you to understand what we are looking at in terms of your P wave, your QRS, and your T wave. And then also we're going to be looking at the PR interval, which starts at the beginning of the P wave, so when the P wave starts to leave the baseline, and it ends here when it starts at the QRS. And then you also have your QRS, and we're going to be measuring that as well. So you will need to know your PR interval, your QRS interval, and then you will also be looking at your P waves and your QRS waves to make sure that they look similar and are they present, etc. So this is what we're looking at, and this represents the conduction through the heart. So P wave, it's really important to remember that the P wave represents the atrium and the QRS represents the ventricle. This chart here kind of goes through what the representation of each is. And so I would like you to try to commit this to your memory because I believe it's easier to understand if you can determine what it represents when you're looking at your P, QRS, and your T wave. Here are some normals that you'll want to also commit to your memory below 0.12 seconds, and then also the PR interval is between 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. And in this next slide, I'm going to show you how we measure those. So one little tiny box is 0.04 seconds. So if you remember that, that will be useful in helping you measure out and determining what rhythm you have. And then 5 small boxes represented by a larger, can you tell that these lines are darker red? And that is because we consider this a large box. And a large box has 5 small boxes within it, and this is 0.2 seconds. And so if you have a QRS wave, if you remember from the previous slide, a PR interval, your PR interval can be 0.12 seconds to 0.2 seconds. That's what's considered normal. And so it can be as long as one big red box. So this is kind of how you measure. I want to go through now and talk about a systematic approach to interpreting EKGs. And so the first thing that you are going to look at is the regularity of it. So if you had calibers, and unless you work on a cardiovascular unit or you are a teletech, you are probably not going to have calibers readily available to you. So you're going to be eyeballing it a lot, where you can mark on a piece of paper to march out to see if it's regular. But is your rhythm regular? So does your QRS complex come at the same time every time? Okay, do they what we call march out? Is your rhythm regular? Next, you want to look at your rate. And when going through this, there is a video on rn.com that talks about measuring the heart rate. But in general, just a very simple rule of thumb, it will get you a close, maybe not exactly accurate, but it'll get you a close reading, is when you have a strip, you should assume it's a 6-second strip unless otherwise told to you. So a 6-second strip, you will take it and you will count your QRS complex, which remember that represents the ventricle, and you will count it and you will multiply it by 10, and that will be your heart rate. And we will do that, and I will show you that in some of the next few slides. Then you want to look at your P wave. Is your P wave regular? Do you even have a P wave? Do they march out? Is there always a P wave in front of a QRS? But here are a list of things that you always want to look at regarding your P waves. And remember, your P wave represents the atrium. Then you will move to your PR interval and you will measure it. Is it constant? Is it long or is it short? That kind of represents the conduction down to the ventricles. So you will be measuring that PR interval. And then you also want to look at your QRS complex. And is it too wide? Is it narrow? Are they regular? Does it come after every P wave? Does it come early without a P wave? Those are some of the things that you're going to be looking at for your QRS. So now let's go through some of these rhythms and just talk about it. And this is normal sinus rhythm here. And so everything that you see down here is what normal sinus rhythm is. So your rhythm should always be regular with normal sinus rhythm. Your rate should be 60 to 100. Your P waves are upright, they're uniform, so they all look the same, and you should always have a P wave in front of a QRS. If you have a P wave in front of a QRS, that means that that heartbeat was initiated in the atriums at the SA node, which is what is normal. Okay, so then you're going to look at your PR interval, and this is what is normal. So your 0.12 to 0.2 seconds is what is normal. And your PR interval should always be constant. Okay, that's what normal sinus rhythm is. And then your QRS here, there's a little bit of differing information as for that first slide. That information that I showed you that was below 0.12 seconds came out of ATI. So you're not going to be wrong if you have below 0.12 seconds or below 0.1, but it should be narrow. And that should always happen after a P wave. So again, this is what normal sinus rhythm looks like. If you can commit normal sinus rhythm to your memory, then you will have an easier time distinguishing what the other rhythms are. So we're going to go to sinus bradycardia. Okay, and if you look through this information and compare it to what we saw on normal sinus rhythm, the only thing that's different is that our heart rate is less than 60. Okay, so we still have a P wave. They're uniform. Okay, they march out. We still have our QRSs. They're uniform and they march out. Okay, and then our PR interval, so you start at the beginning of the P wave and you go to the beginning of the QRS, and it is not larger than one red box, so we're good there. And then our QRS is narrow, and if you could zoom in on this picture, it is below the 0.12 seconds. So again, the only thing that is different is that our heart rate is less than 60. And on this, assuming this is a 6-second strip, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my heart rate is 50. Next, we have sinus tachycardia. This was one that some people got mixed up on the worksheet, so take note to this one. Again, everything down here is the same as normal sinus rhythm except for the rate. So is it regular? It is. Your QRSs, they march out. They come at the same time. There's the same amount of distance between them. Okay, so let's count our heart rate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So we have a heart rate at 130. So it is between the 100 to 160. We're going to look at our P waves. Our P waves come at the same time and they march out. And then our PR interval does not look like it's any larger than one red box or one, deep red box. And then our QRS is narrow. So again, the only thing that is different from normal sinus rhythm here is that our heart rate is fast. So next we're going to look at sinus arrhythmia. Sinus arrhythmia is irregular, which means our ventricle, our QRS, does not march out. There's a longer distance between these two than between these two, and so forth. So this is an irregular rhythm. Our heart rate is still normal though, 60 to 100 beats per minute, and our P waves are still upright and uniform. Our PR interval and our QRS are still normal at below the 0.12 seconds. So sinus arrhythmia is just that the rhythm is irregular, okay? Moving on to a flutter. This is an atrial rhythm. So if this is an atrial rhythm, based off of the knowledge we previously talked about, you are going to be looking at the P wave because the P wave is what represents the atrium. So if you have an atrial rhythm, you're looking at the P wave, okay? And this rhythm can be regular or it can be irregular. It just depends on, what your ventricle is doing in response to your P waves. However, if you go down here to rate, it talks a little bit about your atrial rate, and then you also have a ventricle rate. And of course, that ventricle rate depends on the AV conduction. But here, this rhythm, it shows us that it is regular, and our ventricle rate is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're at 100. But then our atrial rate, if you look at the P waves, we have 2 P waves, okay, to every QRS. Both of these are P waves. And our P waves for atrial flutter look sawtooth or cloud-like in appearance. So you can see this here. And you may have like maybe 3 P waves to a QRS, or 2 or 4, just kind of depends. You don't have to have one that looks just exactly like this. You might have more P waves, but it stays pretty consistent. And your PR interval cannot be measured because there's too many P waves. So there's not a well-defined PR interval. And then you also have the narrow QRS. So that is normal. So remember, when we are talking about atrial rhythms, we are talking about the P waves. So you want to be paying attention to that P wave. Now we're going to go to AFib. AFib is irregular. It is irregularly irregular, okay? So your QRSs do not march out. And AFib means that your atrium is just sitting there and is just kind of going crazy. Kind of like in VFib, it just sits there and it quivers. Well, in AFib, your atriums just sit there and they quiver. And so when you look at that, right here, you can't define a P wave. It's just kind of chaotic. And it's just kind of those fibrillatory marks there. And I'm going to end this presentation, and I will start a new screencast-o-matic to finish this presentation.